Welcome to Dispatches, the official podcast for the Journal of the American Revolution. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Today, our guest is Journal of the American Revolution contributor and author Jude Pfister, and he'll be discussing the Federalist Papers. Jude, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Brady. Thank you for having me on.
Jude, you've been on the show before. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. My background, I've spent 30 years with the National Park Service as a historian and curator in the field of historic preservation at a number of very recognizable historic sites across, mostly in the Northeast. The home of Franklin Roosevelt, the Adams home in Quincy, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton in Seneca Falls. So yes, I've had some wonderful places, assignments, if you will.
Yeah, Jude, what's been your favorite? Just out of curiosity, I'm a little bit of a national park nut myself, so.
I would have to say it's a tie between the Adams site and the Longfellow House. In Cambridge. The Longfellow House, both sites have fantastic libraries, which really appeal to me, and along with great stories that span 18th, 19th, and into the 20th centuries, and how they became national historic sites.
Excellent. Okay, Jude, let's talk about today's article. What drew your interest into this topic? It's been pretty well covered, so what made you say you'd like to sort of take a new crack at it?
I would say, perhaps like other people, a good teacher or a good professor, and I happen to have the good fortune to have both in high school and then certainly in college. I had a government professor who assigned some of the papers as an assignment, and I had, again, the good fortune to have an American history professor who allowed me time during office hours to discuss a different class. He was not the government instructor. He was American history, but I had him for another class. But anyways, so I would say that, and probably they pop up just about everywhere in things that you read, but there's not a lot of explanation, at least to my satisfaction.
Jude, how would you say we as historians, and maybe just as the general public, regard the Federalist Papers? We have a pretty good handle on the founding documents. How do you see them fitting into that story?
I think historians overall have a good view of the Federalist Papers. I think one of the problems or issues is that they're both plural and singular, in the sense that you call them the Federalist, even though that's plural, but it almost sounds like it's just one thing. But then when you say the Federalist Papers, clearly plural, and so they're hard to boil down to just one or two topics that might make it easy for a quick overview or an engaging read on your bedside table. And I think there's a case to be made that they could be better handled for the non-professional reader, the person who doesn't live with these things day in and day out. And I think at least most of what I have come across over the years has been historians generally writing for other historians. Again, they do certainly pop up in anthologies of American founding documents, but they lack a lot of context, I think. And they'll just pop up with 1, 2, 3 of the more popular or more easier to digest. Number one, they're written in a very stilted language, as I'm sure you know. They don't flow easily off the tongue. Sentences that go on for several a paragraph sometimes is almost a sentence. But the point is that they're not written in a way that we speak or read in the 21st century. They're almost becoming pure history as opposed to actionable history. And by that I mean just something that's studied so that we're aware of it, but not, excuse me, but not necessarily taking what it's talking about at and putting it into use.
Excellent. Okay, Jude, so maybe for the novice, maybe for some people this is the first time they're going to dive into these documents. Give us the rundown on the papers. Firstly, who wrote them? What can you tell us about the writers?
Well, there were three writers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Hamilton came up with the idea in probably late September, early October of 1787, just after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia finished its work. Constitution Day, September 17th, they finished in 1787. And Hamilton had approached several New Yorkers, but he settled on Madison and Jay. Madison, of course, being a Virginian. And I think that was very wise because it did add a little balance, even though at the time it was all done anonymously. Nobody knew that there was a Southerner or a Northerner on the group that wrote these. Hamilton would write slightly over 50, so there were 85 total essays. Hamilton would write slightly over 50, Madison somewhere in the vicinity of 26, 27, and then John Jay about 5. And the numbers to this day are still disputed. It keeps a very small niche of scholars busy trying to determine who wrote what. And part of that was because it was done anonymously. And as time went on, as Madison lived the longest of the three, and Jay died in 1829, Madison in 1836. Madison would, towards the end of his life, probably confuse some of them. So there were, as I say, 85. Jay only wrote 5 because he was incapacitated very early on in the project. However, he wrote separately an address to the people of New York, which appeared in the spring of 1788. And the reason that Jay really bowed out, he was incapacitated, but yet he was still writing in favor of the Constitution, was, bear in mind, these were coming out at a rate of 2 essays a week for just slightly over 6 months. So to reach that 85. And so the pace of work had to have been grueling. And this was, again, all before they could sit there and get on things like this and talk to each other about what they were doing. And so the main purpose of the papers from the very beginning was to promote the passage of the proposed Constitution in the state of New York, Hamilton's home state. Hamilton was very concerned about the prospects of passage of the Constitution in New York. And they took the name, I said it was anonymous, they took the collective name of Publius, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. Each letter is signed Publius. And Publius was for Publius Publicola, the Roman statesman who was very instrumental in founding the Roman Republic, not the Roman Empire. For the ancient Roman history people, there are 2 major components to Rome, the Empire and the Republic. The founders were very keen on associating themselves with the Republic period of Roman history. So, again, in total, there were 85 essays. 77 appeared in newspapers. They were the New York Packet, the Daily Advertiser, and the Independent Journal. And as I say, there were 85 total. 77 would appear in newspapers. These were kind of our version of an op-ed, if you will. And immediately, they were recognized beyond New York. Word started to filter out, as it did quickly in the colonies, in the States by then. And the essays started to, again, creep into the Mid-Atlantic and then into the southern states. And by March of 1788, you have the first volume appearing of the Federalist. And by May, 2 months later, you have the second volume. So it was a 2-volume set. And what made the second volume unique is that I mentioned 77 essays appeared in the newspaper. That second volume had 8 more essays that never appeared in the newspapers. So they were kind of a bonus almost, if you will. And just one last thing, the Federalist, not to confuse things more, at the time in 1787-88, the proponents of the Constitution, those in favor, called themselves nationalists. Those who opposed it called themselves Federalist. And Hamilton took the name Federalist as a way to kind of be conciliatory to trying to bring both sides together. So it was, it can sometimes be confusing just by that. And then, of course, you know that there were what is today called the Anti-Federalist Papers. So it just gets a little murky with names. But you have these 2 volumes. Today they're collector's items, really. Some of them can go for, in good condition, if on a good day, $200,000. A first edition, a pristine edition. You know, they were published in both leather bindings and just plain cloth or paperboard. So you know, it ran the gamut just like it does today. You have your Penguin Classics, and then you have some that are still published in leather. But that's fewer and far between are those types of books nowadays.
Excellent. So, Jude, you have dozens of choices here to talk about in your article, but a finite amount of time. In your article, you key in on Madison's number 10. Tell us why that one stood out to you.
Madison number 10 was the first appearance of James Madison. Again, it was anonymous. They didn't know it at the time, but in hindsight, we know it was his first contribution to the Federalist project. And number 10 usually pops up on most, I would say, college reading lists, partly, and I think primarily because it talks about faction. What Madison called faction, what we would today associate with political parties or political movements. And what Madison argued in essay 10, was that faction was human nature. Everyone covets power, mostly everyone. And some covet it more than others. And what Hamilton argued was that while you can't legislate or stop someone from wanting that power or seeking that power, what you can do is somehow minimize the impact of that one person or their political movement, what he called faction. And so, and this could be a minority or majority as Madison understood it. And so he argued that a kind of an understood aspect of 1789, 1787, 88 of a republic was that it worked best in a small area, maybe something the size of a state or maybe two states. But what Madison argued was just the opposite. Some of the opponents, those who were against the Constitution, were arguing that you can't have a republic because the Constitution created a federal republic. And what Madison did in number 10 was, again, not only argue about human nature, faction, and groups, he also argued that a large territory was the best way to reduce the dangers of faction. Because what you did in his argument was the multiplicity of factions would best be diluted over a larger territory. And indeed, he wrote that to break and control the violence, he called it violence, of faction, the only way to do that was have a large territory. It was a interesting argument, and I think it still resonates today. I think that's one of the reasons it is usually assigned. I've done some very unscientific surveys with colleagues, and it generally does pop up on the syllabus, and it's almost always included in any anthology of American founding documents.
So you mentioned, Jude, you mentioned factionalism being one of the topics. The Federalist Papers cover a wide gamut of topics. What do you think are some of the other important topics or themes that pop up throughout these 85 documents?
Well, I would say the big one is union. It's fascinating how many times that word comes up. Union is the answer to all of our problems. That's I'm embellishing a little bit, but in 1787, 88, union, it was union. And that term, that idea, that concept is sprinkled throughout all 85 essays. And that is often contrasted with the Articles of Confederation, which of course preceded the Constitution, and how weak the Articles were at that time. Other topics are taxation, money policy, something of a, loathing isn't the right word, but something of a keeping pure democracy at arm's length, which may be surprising to some people. That's a term that we use in the 20th and 21st century, but it certainly means something very different than it did to the founders. Again, I mentioned republic comes up quite a bit. Madison spends several essays on what amounts to a history lesson in ancient republics, up through the Florence and into the Renaissance period. They certainly go through the first three articles, the first article being Congress, House of Representatives, and Senate. Article 2, the President, and Article 3, the Supreme Court, or the judiciary. Madison handled that beautifully. And Hamilton handled the judiciary, being the one lawyer, along with, John Jay, but he was sidelined. But Hamilton wrote wonderfully on the judiciary, which was something, really, the Constitution was really something new, a written Constitution. This was something that was in the world of non-monarchy, even in monarchies, to have a Constitution. This was a written Constitution, and having a national judiciary was something completely new, and in particular, a Supreme Court, which Article 3 called for. So I think those are probably there's personal opinion scattered throughout them too, but again, you don't know who that person is. So those would pretty well cover the majority of the topics.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Jude. So they're writing under the same pen name, but these men do have some pretty serious ideological differences, I think. What are some of the clues we can use to maybe pick out who's actually behind the pen in these instances?
Well, it's interesting because, as I said, that there are still upwards of a dozen papers that are in dispute as to who wrote them. I wouldn't say that there are great ideological differences. I think the authors did a good job in setting aside those personal views. They certainly had their strengths in that Jay wrote about international affairs. Essays 2 through 5, I believe. I mentioned Hamilton writing about the judiciary in numbers 78 through roughly 83, being a lawyer. Hamilton wrote the essays on taxation and national debt, which are even today some pretty high-level thinking. Madison, being the scholar he was, I mentioned he takes on a professorial tone where he goes through the history. Madison also was strong on legislation. He was a master legislator. He was in the House of Burgesses. He was in the Continental Congress. He was in the Governor's Council. He was on a whole range of legislative bodies by the 1780s. So I would say, I mentioned Adams, the Adams House. If you go there, and maybe if you ask real nice, I don't know, but there's a copy of the Federalist Papers that John Quincy Adams owned. And at the end of each one, under Publius, he wrote who he thought it was.
Interesting.
And that would be something I think would make a great topic for somebody. But anyways, so even at the time they were trying to figure out, as an example, Madison, the Southerner, he wrote about slavery. Hamilton, whether he picked Madison for that, I don't know. But I think it was a smart move on his part, because I don't think Hamilton could have done some of the verbal gymnastics with slavery that Madison did, being an enslaver. So that was probably a good move on Hamilton's part to secure Madison's participation. So again, I think by and large the ideology for union, the ideology for a Republican kind of government with a small r, the idea of a strong central government, those kind of bedrock basic ideological approaches to the Constitution, those are about as close as you can get to being the same in these three writers.
Jude, you mentioned slavery already here in the interview. You write about it in your article as well. What do these papers say about slavery? Because like you mentioned, it takes a fair amount of flexibility to circle some of these squares, I think.
Mm-hmm. It does. And the Constitution, some would argue, is, well, Justice Thurgood Marshall said the Constitution is a slave document. So if you were to take that line of reasoning, that everything in it is a compromise to make sure that the southern states even though slavery existed in the North, we know that, but it was the Southern states that were driving this kind of approach to an economic system based on slavery. But I think that might go a little too far. But the two where the term is used, and that's just what I focused on. You can read between the lines all you want on a lot of these essays, but the two where essays are number 42 and 57. And in both of them, Madison reflects on how the Constitution arrives at slavery and also deals with the enslaved. So, as an example, in 42, he focuses on the clause in the Constitution, I forget which section, which calls for the end of the slave trade in 1808, 20 years into the future. However, the Constitution called for the end to the trade, but not to the practice of enslavement. And of course, depending on what side of the fence you were on, they would say, well, if you end the importation of Africans, then slavery is going to eventually just die a natural death. But there were others who said, no, that's not true, because they're going to keep, natural processes what they are. There's going to be new children, etc., and that slavery would continue. And Madison takes the more positive approach. So he's a Southerner, but he writes to remember, he was writing for the people in New York. So he was taking a positive approach that, oh yes, we're going to end the trade in 1808, but I think that's going to eventually lead to the ending of slavery, which of course we know didn't happen. And then in number 54, essay 54, is where he really gets into his verbal gymnastics, because he's talking about representation in Congress. And we all know about the 3/5 clause that's in the Constitution. And Madison is arguing about that and really goes to great lengths to show that at the time that the Constitution was written, the prevailing intellectual ideas was the Enlightenment, and part of that was natural law. So Madison argues that under natural law, Africans are not slaves, that they are as free as anyone. But then he says that because the Constitution is not based on natural law, it's a positive law in the sense that it's man-made. I'll just use that. Positive law gets hairy, but we'll just say because it's created by human beings. He said that's why Africans can be enslaved. It's only because it's by the law, the Constitution, creates them as such. And again, he's writing for New York, so leaving open the option that, okay, if the Constitution created enslavement, it can also undo it because there's an amendment process. So it's 54 is essay 54 is a very interesting one. So those are the two primary places where enslavement are dealt with.
Okay, Jude. So, the question we always like to end with on this show kind of gets to the heart of what we do as historians. How does this article, in your opinion, help us understand the Revolutionary Era better?
I think it's the ending of the Revolutionary Era. I think there's a 25-year period from the writs of assistance cases, in which kind of begins it all in 1763. It's a nice little 25-year period up until 1788, where the colonies slash states become a nation, a government. And as John Jay argued in his essays, this isn't just a domestic government. This is a government, a national government for other nations. We can go out and take our place in the world. So I think it's a nice ending of that kind of revolutionary period. The revolution was not just the battles, etc. Because once they won, you got to do something. So again, I think I would tip my hat to John Jay for arguing that in his few essays that he did, was that this is the Constitution. This is a document that is our place in the world, shows our place in the world as a free nation.
Excellent. Well, Jude Pfister, as always, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Brady.